Give people 20 or 30 seconds to start to show up. It often takes a minute or two. And once I get confirmation that the stream is live, I will start the event. Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me. The sound should be coming through very nicely. Just hearing that it may not be. Let me just confirm with somebody. Excuse me a second. Great, good. Well, good afternoon. My name is Azeem, and I'm the creator of Exponential View. It's fantastic to have such a good audience with us today. I am be holding a short conversation with Professor Nicholas Christakis of Yale University to discuss the long shadow of COVID and what the pandemic will look like over the next couple of years, and when we might expect to get to a post-pandemic order. For those of you who don't know about Exponential View, I just want to spend a minute or two telling you a little bit about it. It is a network which convenes around a set of ideas exploring the future potentials of our exponential age, the time that we find ourselves in with these tremendous technologies of biology and artificial intelligence, computation and AI, all coming together at around the same time with the promise that it might help us reinvent our world and help us ask the questions about what kind of world we want to reinvent into. COVID has, of course, come along and rather accelerated and changed some of those discussions. You're enjoying a session on Friday, which is one of our new series of talks with authors. This is the second in the series with Professor Christakis. I want to tell you what's coming up shortly. Today's discussion is live on LinkedIn. Please do also find it on Twitter and YouTube, and you can tweet using the hashtag COVID-19 and #EV Apollo. Apollo is part of the title of Nicholas's book. There's a Q&A as well available for Exponential View Premium members in our invite-only community. If you do want to become a member of the newsletter, you can join at exponentialview.co/Apollo, where there is a special 19% discount today. Just to tell you about the upcoming events, we have a discussion with Tabitha Goldstab, who's the chair of the AI Council for the UK government, around her new book, How to Talk with Robots. That's next week. And the week after, we're with John Micklethwaite, the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, who's just published his latest book with Adrian Wooldridge, How the Pandemic Has Exposed Weakness in the West. So please do sign up for both of those. There'll be details going out to subscribers soon enough. So with that, let's move on to our main event. Nicholas Christakis, a social scientist and physician at Yale University, an incredibly scholarly man. We're very lucky to have him today. He's just published a book, Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live. Nicholas, welcome to Exponential View.
Thank you for having me, Azeem.
Now, I have to say I did love the book, and I do recommend it to anybody who is watching. It seems like you had quite a constructive lockdown, didn't you?
Yeah, so I like other people in the United States. Beginning early March, my family and I were sequestered in our home here in Vermont, and I started working on this book in the middle of March and worked on it nonstop for 4 months, and here it is out now. But it's important to note that 30 million Americans are out of work. 300,000 Americans have lost their lives to this. Many family members have loved ones that have died. So it is true that I've been productive and that my family so far is unscathed. But, I'm very worried about this pandemic.
It comes across in your in the book and, of course, in the evidence that we're starting to gather that this is quite serious. It's quite a serious disease. Towards the tail end of the book, you and in a recent tweet, you map it out as being the most serious respiratory illness that we have seen since the 1918 influenza epidemic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we now understand from the state of the science of the nature of the disease, its transmissibility, and the kind of fatalities that it can cause?
So at the beginning, what happened, of course, is that sometime in November, something very unusual happened to us as a species. A new pathogen leapt into our species. And this pathogen then got out of control and is going to be with us forever. So this coronavirus species is going to circulate among us forever. When this first happened, we didn't know much about the pathogen, but now we're 10 months in, and scientists know quite a bit about this pathogen. So let's start with how deadly is it? We now know from numerous studies, it was just a meta-analysis released a couple of weeks ago, that this pathogen kills between 0.5 and 0.8% of the people that are infected with it. So, and if you get symptoms from it or come to medical attention, the number is about twice that. So people with symptoms of coronavirus have about a 1% chance of death. That's actually pretty high. It's about 10 times higher than the flu. No, it's not as bad as the bubonic plague. It's not as bad as smallpox. It's not as bad as cholera. It could be not as bad as Ebola. It could be much worse, but it's not trivial either. It's a pretty significant fatality rate associated with this pathogen. And as most listeners know, it varies a lot by age. The younger you are, the less likely you are to die of it if you get it. If you're under 20 and you get sick from it, you might have a 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 5,000 chance of death. If you're 80 or older and you get sick from it, you might have a 1 in 5 chance of dying from it. But the important thing for young people is that young people are unlikely to die no matter what. In other words, taking a 1 in 3,000 chance of death if you're young is stupid, right? I mean, I'm glad you're young. If you get it, you're not likely to die, but you're not likely to die of anything if you're young. So really, you shouldn't be taking this for granted, this, increased risk of death. Anyway, yeah. I'm talking too much probably, but that's a quick summary of how deadly the disease is. Should I go on?
No, we were going to go on for another 35 minutes, but let's just summarize that. So we're identifying a 0.5 to 0.8% fatality rate. If you get symptoms, it's about double that.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. And if you get symptoms, it's double that. What about the transmissibility? What do we know now as we have 8-9 months worth of data about how transmissible this virus is?
Well, again, this is, we know now. So there's something called the R naught, which is the reproduction number of a pathogen. That is, for each case in a non-immune, naturally interacting population, how many new cases of the disease do you get? And this number is between 2.5 and 3.5, probably between 2.6 and 3 is the R naught, the innate transmissibility of this pathogen. And that's pretty significant too, by the way. So seasonal flu might have an R naught of 1.5. For each case of the flu, you get 1.5 new cases. People should be thinking now, they should have the intuition that if the number is below 1, that means the epidemic is declining. So if you get an R naught of 0.9, if that's the natural R naught of the pathogen, you don't actually get epidemic outbreaks. And when we engage in lockdowns or school closures or physical distancing, we're manipulating not the R naught, which is the intrinsic transmissibility of the pathogen. We're manipulating a different so-called R number, the R sub E, the effective reproductive rate. Mm-hmm. And that's, how is the pathogen actually spreading, given, right. And of course, if we all became hermits, if we all lived by ourselves, then there'd be no new case for each index case. So we drive the R sub E to 0, which is what we're trying to do when we engage in the physical distancing and other so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions. Anyway, right. So you can take those two parameters, mm-hmm. how deadly the germ is and how transmissible it is, and create a little graph, let's say the lethality of pathogens on the x-axis and the transmissibility on the y-axis, and you can plot all of the respiratory pandemics from the last 100 years on those axes.
Right.
We've had, 20 of pandemics in the last 100 years. And this pathogen would be the second worst we've had since the 1918 pandemic.
Right, absolutely. So it's nearly as transmissible as the 1918 pandemic influenza, and it is nearly as deadly.
I wouldn't say it's much less deadly than the 1918 pandemic, but it's the second worst we've had for sure in the last 100 years.
Right. There's a graph of this, I think, I'm now mixing up whether it's on your tweet stream or at the end of your book,
both.
But it's in both. Right. Okay, perfect. So one of the things I think that I feel we have done over the last 10 months is talk a lot about fatality rates and talk much less about what long-term health consequences for people who suffer from the disease but recover might be. And there are lots of stories about long COVID, as they're calling it, and multi-system problems with cognitive systems, with breathing, with the kidney function, and so on. What do we know about the effects that this disease has on people who recover and fall into that long COVID or sort of acute problems thereafter?
We know that many people will have, even if they don't die, will have disability from this condition. We don't know what percentage yet and over what time horizon. If I had to guess, or if the guesses in the literature now are that perhaps 5% of people who had serious illness and who survived the illness will have some form of long-term disability, pulmonary fibrosis, renal insufficiency, cardiac or neurological problems. It's very difficult to know for sure, and in fact, we won't know for sure until 2 or 3 years go by, right? This is the kind of thing we can only know when we observe cohorts of patients prospectively. So even now we have large numbers of people who have disability as a result of the coronavirus, but maybe they'll get better in 6 months or a year. We don't know for sure yet. Right. So about 5%, I would estimate.
So, and thinking back to previous respiratory viruses or other types of diseases that we've contended with, how does that ratio of sort of long-term effects put coronavirus or COVID-19 compared to the previous ones?
I don't know the answer to that. So we're talking about a 5-to-1 ratio right now of disability to death. And in 1918, it was probably similar. In 1957, which was the last influenza pandemic, I haven't seen information. So I don't know the answer to that. But I can tell you that it's not uncommon for viruses to cause a mix of death and disability. But the precise percentage, I don't know.
Does the seasonal flu leave us with disabilities?
Rarely, nowhere near as commonly. Yes, that's a good benchmark.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. I mean, I think we'll get into this question about what our response has been a bit later on, but that the impact of this, the disability disease burden, may be quite significant relative to the impact of the death burden, in a sense.
Yes, that's exactly right. So the impact so there was a paper just published by Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary of the United States, and an economist and a colleague of his, David Cutler, also an economist at Harvard University. And they published this little sort of analysis, and they call this virus in the United States the $16 trillion virus. We have 8 trillion, these are enormous sums of money, an $8 trillion loss due to the economic impact, and distinct from that, an $8 trillion loss due to death and disability. And only part of that was due to death, just as you're saying. So if we could have as many as 1 million deaths in the United States. I would say we're going to have at least 500,000 before this thing is over. And we'll have some number between 500,000 and 1 million, I think, in the end. And 5 times as many of those people disabled. That's a lot of disability. If we had 5 million disabled Americans, there are only 750,000 Americans, just as a benchmark, with end-stage renal disease. So that's a tremendous burden of disability in our society. And I think you could just divide those numbers by 5 for England, and you get a kind of sense of the scale of the problem.
Right. I mean, it's pretty huge. It's pretty huge. We can now do some calculations, though. We can say, well, look, if there's a, roughly speaking, a 0.8%, 0.8% fatality rate, and maybe 5 times out of 4% disability rate across the US, you're looking at potentially 2.5 million is in terms of deaths and 10 million in terms of disabilities. But of course, the number will be much lower.
No. It's those rates apply to people who get infected. So not everyone in the society will get infected. So, for example, we'll either because of a vaccine or because of natural immunity, we will reach something called herd immunity. So the final attack rate in the United States for this pathogen, even if it was just running loose on its own, probably the attack rate would be, let's say, 50% or something like that, maybe more, but in that ballpark. So if there are 330 million Americans, 165 million would be infected. Let's say 0.5% of them, or let's say 1 to simplify the calculation. Let's say 1% of them would die. That would be 1.6 million. But it's not going to be 1%. It'll be 0.5% of them will die. So 800,000 will die, and 5 times that, let's say 4 million will have disabilities. So that's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. Yeah. I mean, it's a really scary set of numbers. And I just wanted to benchmark for viewers what the science is currently telling us about this. So I'm curious, we're all in Europe and in the US, but not in some parts of Asia, going through a second or a third wave. And in some cases in Europe, it looks like in terms of infections, it's going to be more aggressive than the first wave. Do you think that was a sort of inevitability based on where we were in March or April?
Yes. I mean, I'm not familiar with a respiratory pandemic in the last century that hasn't come in waves. I mean, this is a very standard thing for respiratory pandemics. Absolutely. So we're on schedule. We're for the northern hemisphere, because it goes by the weather.
Yeah.
So the northern hemisphere on schedule, we're having our second wave. And in 1918, the second wave was 4 times as deadly as the first wave. It varies from pandemic to pandemic. I'd be surprised if in this pandemic the second wave was better. I think it's going to be as bad as the first wave. And there's a semantic argument taking place in the United States. I don't know about the UK, about whether we ever finished the first wave. Is it still part of the first? But that's sort of silly. I mean, there was a wave when the germ first hit us in March. It should have gone down if we had behaved better over the summer, and then we would be seeing a new peak now, which we are seeing in the United States right now. I think yesterday over 1,000 Americans died, and that's every day. 1,000 people are dying. It's really. I have 2 things to say about that. First is, I think it's very important for your listeners to understand that, in a way, it's nobody's fault that this is happening to our species. I mean, this plagues have afflicted our species for thousands of years. Yeah. We think this is such a crazy thing that's happening, and we have to lock down our economies and stay away from our friends. This feels so alien and unnatural. But plagues are not new to our species. They're just new to us.
Yeah.
We think this is so crazy, but it's not. And what is called from us at this point is a lot of maturity. By maturity, I mean, first of all, acceptance, like recognizing that, when you're grown up, you sort of recognize you can't wish bad things away. You just have to accept the world, And second, maturity in the sense of addressing this problem in an adult fashion, which means being responsible. And I think many people, many politicians, and many people on the street have kind of had this fantasy that we could deny our way out of this pandemic or lie our way out of this pandemic. The virus doesn't care about what we say. The virus is just doing its thing. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that this is happening, that it's not going to stop, and that we have to cope with it. I went on a digression. I forgot what the kernel of your question was. I'm sorry.
No, I think you've got to a very good point here, though, which is that the virus is here. It's 120 nanometers of protein. It's pretty implacable. It doesn't have opinions. It just does the thing it does, and it doesn't even know it's doing it.
Yeah.
And it's going to march its way through. I suppose the question. Let's talk about forward-looking questions. Of course, everybody wants to know, could we have done better? And of course, with the power of hindsight, everyone could have done better. But we're 10 months into this.
That was your question.
Yeah, that was my question. But I think we
could have done. Yes, we could have done better.
Could have done better.
Yes,
right.
That's
right.
correct.
Yeah, I mean, I back in February when I started to get nervous about all of this. I bought my first face masks at the end of January and a couple of liters of alcohol gel in early February. I thought it'll take a couple of years for things to sort of pan out. I didn't really understand what was going on. I thought it would be about a vaccine back then. And that would be the thing. And it might take 18 months to get a vaccine and 6 months to stick it in our arms. But it seems it's going to be a different process, a more evolved process, a more staged process, that some parts of which will move quicker than we thought and some parts of which would move slower. So we're 10 months into this. How do you imagine the next few years will work their way out?
I think of this as having three phases. So I consider the first phase, which we're in now, to be the immediate phase, the immediate period, when the virus is first spreading in us and having its biological and epidemiological impact. And this phase will end, I think, in 2022, when one of two things has happened by then. Either we will have invented a vaccine, which I think we will invent a vaccine of unclear safety and efficacy sometime in 2021, but then it will take about a year to manufacture, distribute, because distributing this vaccine won't be easy. That from the moment it's manufactured to the moment it's injected, it has to be refrigerated.
Right.
So we have to build something called a cold chain. I mean, we have a cold chain, but we have to use it. And finally, acceptance of the vaccine. We have to get large numbers of people to willingly be vaccinated. So that, I think, will take about a year, even if we invent a vaccine quickly. So that takes us to 2022. Meanwhile, the germ is still spreading, and like we were saying, implacably. And so even if we don't invent a vaccine, by 2022, we're going to reach the point of herd immunity, which I think is at about, for various network science reasons, is at about 45% of the public has to be infected. In the United States right now, only about 10 or 11% of the Americans have been infected. So we've got a long way to go. In fact, I would say, just this part of what I would like to summarize is that we're not, as Churchill famously said, we're not at the beginning of the end of this pandemic by any means. We're just at the end of the beginning.
Yes.
So we're going to be in this immediate phase until 2022, by which point either we'll have a vaccine or reach herd immunity. And then the intermediate phase will begin, because even though we'll have the biological and epidemiological impacts behind us, we're going to have still the psychological, social, and economic impacts to deal with. We're not going to suddenly, our economies aren't going to suddenly boom. People aren't going to suddenly throw off their masks and go to the airport and fly somewhere. People are going to be shell-shocked. Many people will have lost their jobs. Some people will have, as we were talking about, disability, clinical effects. And so I think that period will last a couple of years, judging from previous epidemics, till about 2024. And then in 2024, the post-pandemic period will begin. And so up until then, people will have become more religious, which is typical of pandemics, more abstemious. There'll be penny pinching. People are saving their money. They're not spending it. But then, we're going to have the roaring 20s, just like after 1918. I think we're going to have a lot of joie de vivre. There'll be some risk taking. People will mass in crowds. There'll be political rallies and concerts, and 4 years of reduced social interaction will be this pent up demand. More sexual licentiousness, judging from previous pandemics.
Right.
So one of a review of my book just appeared, and Neil Ferguson, who was a reviewer, said, "Here's hoping." When we describe, what would happen. So 2024, I think, will be when the post-pandemic period will begin, and there will still be some changes in our society at that point. Our society will have been reshaped in certain ways, which we can talk about if you want at that point. That's how I see it. 3 phases.
Oh, wonderful. 3 phases. We definitely need to talk about that third phase, but let's come into the tail end of this first phase and getting into that moment, 2022, when this has burnt itself out. So we're at an interesting point. 180 odd vaccines in development, 3 that seem to be leading the way from, Moderna and Pfizer and the Oxford vaccine. I'm quite curious about how you look at the ways in which these vaccines have been developed. And this key question that strikes me is, how will we actually get it out into a billion arms in a short period of time? And is there any danger that we see a sort of what I termed vaccine colonialism? The former FDA wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street, head of the FDA wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal back in April, where he said, America needs to get the vaccine first so that our enemies don't get it. Scott Gottlieb, I think, is the guy's name. And I read that and I thought that's not what I wanted to hear during a sort of a public health emergency that's global. So there is some politics around the vaccine. There's some science around the vaccine. Are you happy with the way that the science has worked out? And how do you think about the politics?
On the science, if we develop a vaccine in 18 months from the discovery of the pathogen, that'll be the fastest we've ever done by many years. I think the last record was something like with Zika or mumps, it was like 5 years. I think we have to have some caution. Your listeners need to know that 50% of phase 3 trials for novel pharmaceuticals end without success. So even though we have 3 phase 3 trials right now, there's a decent chance that one of them would, more than one of them will just be a failure. We'll have the bad news come out that this drug doesn't work. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we find that. But like I said, I do think we will eventually get a vaccine, more than one probably. And I think it'll be in 2021. How safe or effective is unclear. We're racing to do this, and there might be safety concerns. We've already had some warning signs for a couple of the trials, including the Oxford trial, that there might be safety problems. We don't know for sure. And actually, we won't really know for sure until we start rolling it out and giving it to millions of people. And I'm a little concerned that, for example, let's say that the usual fatality rate we tolerate for vaccines is 1 in 10 million to 1 in a million. Right. That is to say, people who die as a result of us giving them the vaccine. But any vaccine for any drug, for any disease rather, saves tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives. So from a public health point of view, vaccination is a no-brainer. But, what if the fatality rate is 1 in 100,000 for this vaccine? It might still be worth the vaccine. It'll save more lives than die. But 1 in 100,000 will seem like a lot of deaths. It will be a lot of deaths for a vaccine. And this will be breathlessly reported. So we won't necessarily have found this in a trial of 30,000 people. There's a good chance, more likely than not, we will not be able to detect a 1 in 100,000 fatality rate. So we'll roll the vaccine out. We'll start giving it to tens of millions of people. Suddenly we will discover. So I'm worried about that possibility. So scientifically, I'm optimistic that we will get it. I'm concerned about safety, and on efficacy, it's depending on which kind of vaccine we develop, and there's probably more information than we need to talk about. It might be the kind of shot you need to get repeatedly, like the seasonal flu shot, or a booster shot, like for tetanus. You need to get a booster shot every now and then. Politically, there's a fascinating geopolitics here. So on the one hand, I think that the Chinese, when the dust begins to settle, I think people, rightly or wrongly, will be pissed at China. Pissed as an American doesn't mean, yes, it means angry in our cross. Yeah. They'll be cross for this. They won't be drunk. They'll be cross with the Chinese. And I think if the Chinese develop a safe and effective vaccine before anyone else, I think that and engage in vaccine diplomacy, I think that might mollify some of the geopolitical adverse consequences for the Chinese. For the rest of the world, I think this could create more problems. I think that it's in the rich countries' interest, if America or England develop this vaccine, to make it widely available, even to developing countries. And I have no doubt that eventually it will be. So initially, certain groups will be vaccinated, starting with healthcare workers and first responders, then rich countries. But eventually, I think the vaccine will be widely available.
I'm a relentless optimist about human nature at this point.
Me too.
Or, or maybe I'm just deeply sort of steeped in real politics, because I feel that with there is so much.
Hold on, which is it? Are you optimistic about people, or are you real
so I'm actually not sure on this point. This is my observation, which is I would love to think that once a vaccine is developed, we would roll these vaccines out as widely as we can to as many people as we can, in order of some reasonable clinical priority, healthcare workers first, and so on. But I think we may end up rolling it out widely, not for that reason, but from a realpolitik reason, which is there is so much political capital to be gained, that this is a low-cost version of soft power or the Marshall Plan, whether you're China or whether you're the US or whether you're the UK, which has got one of the leading vaccines but has diminished its international status over the last 4 years through a variety of actions. So each of the players with the leading contenders has good reasons to make it widely available for their own political capital. And I wonder if that will play a part in how it gets distributed.
Yes, I mean, I think that any country, and let's keep in mind that more than one country is likely to develop a vaccine, and
right.
I think any country that does it will eventually be widely distributed. And I can't imagine our countries withholding the vaccine for political reasons. I can't see us punishing another country by. I mean, I would never support such a thing. I think no civilized person would support such a thing.
Yeah.
But I absolutely see us as trying to appear magnanimous by delivering, spending billions of dollars to buy the drug from the pharmaceutical company and then distributing it for free in other countries around the world. Keep in mind, this distribution won't be easy. We talked about earlier, the cold chain, for example. So it's not trivial to actually get the vaccine in large doses to where it needs to go. But that's what's going to happen.
I think the Moderna vaccine has to be stored at -60 Celsius or centigrade, which is colder than your average freezer.
Oh, by far. One of the drugs is -20 and one is -80.
Right.
And it's not a joke, actually. But it's a solvable problem. It just takes money and time.
So I'm curious, this point up to 2022, people, I think sometimes there's a sense that there could be a silver bullet for solving this pandemic. But I think the point that you make in your book, you talk about the McCown curves, which is that often vaccines arrive once a pandemic has started to burn itself out. And
that's a slightly different point, the McEwen hypothesis.
Right.
But we can go there if you
want.
We can go
there. But I'm thinking about what happens in that period of time in the next 18 months. Now, one of my colleagues is like you. He's a multi-tenanted physician. He's a physician who's also a venture capitalist, and he has come up with what he calls a Swiss cheese model of management, where he says you have all of these layers where you need to, vaccinate, you need to take non-pharmaceutical interventions, and just like any disease condition, at the far end you have Regeneron, which is a thing that sort of saves people's lives, but it's the most expensive. And that our approach over the next 18 months needs to be 5 or 6 different layers of activity, of policy that are implemented and sort of complied with by the people. Do you think that's the right kind of approach, or do you think we can get there with a sort of a single bullet?
So the Swiss cheese model is attributed to James Reason, a psychologist who published these papers in the 1980s and 1990s. Looking at the failure of complex systems like nuclear power or airlines, and has been applied to medicine to look, for instance, at medical error. In the setting of the coronavirus, just for your listeners, the notion is you have slices of Swiss cheese, each of which represents some kind of method of resisting the virus: school closures, border closures, masks wearing, hand hygiene, bans on gatherings, testing and tracing, quarantine procedure. So each of those is a layer of Swiss cheese, which has some deficits and has some holes in it, which the virus could penetrate if it just happened to line up with a hole. And if you imagine making a sandwich with many pieces of Swiss cheese, which have holes randomly in the pieces, after you stack 2 slices, you have to have 2 holes that line up for the virus, and 3 slices, maybe no holes line up. So by the time you have 3 or 4 slices of Swiss cheese, you've formed an effective barrier. And this is one of the reasons, incidentally, there was a super spreading event at the White House in the United States, because they were only relying on testing. Well, testing failed. If they had done testing and masking and physical distancing, then they might not have had a super spreading event. This Swiss cheese model also is helpful in understanding why different countries can have success using different methods. So New Zealand has border closures and quarantine. Greece has school closures and mask wearing. South Korea has testing and masking. So different countries can use different mixes of interventions so long as you do something and more than one thing. 2 or 3 or 4 different things are needed. You've got to pick at least a few that you do in order to slow the spread of the epidemic. Finally, you can also think, as your colleague was saying, you can think of the treatments for these conditions, or even the vaccines, by the way, as a kind of final step or another slice of Swiss cheese. And on their own, they won't be enough.
Yeah, on their own. So we're going to need, over the next 18 months, this matrix that might be adapted for particular cultural or political requirements within a given nation, right? You might choose a different mix of cheeses. I'm a big cheese fan, so I like this idea. A set of different, for each one, right? So let's switch over to what happens after. We have about 10 minutes left in our discussion. I'm curious about that process that goes from your intermediate phase, which is when we're dealing with the clinical, the social, the emotional, the economic shock, and we move into the post-pandemic order. And you talked about an increased religiosity, you talked about increased licentiousness, and so on. I mean, when we look back over how the pandemic played its way out, how well set up we were for it, and what worked, what do you think are the critical lessons we could take forward?
Well, as I talk about in Apollo Zero, it's known that pandemics recur every 10 to 20 years. It's stochastic. In other words, it's not like regularly. It's not like El Nino, which comes every 11 years. Pandemics occur with some interpandemic spell, could be 1 or 2 years, could be 20 years. We only have a serious pandemic like the one we're having every 50 to 100 years. But for example, there was a pandemic in 2009, the H1N1 pandemic, about which I did some research in my lab. And but nobody remembers that pandemic because it was so mild. In other words, it spread, but you got cold symptoms, so nobody died, or few people died. So, and it had waves, it had all the same stuff of the pandemic. We just don't remember it. So it's very difficult to predict when the next big one will come. It could be in 2 years, it could be in 10 years, it could be in 50 years. We don't know. And in some ways, as we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation, we're very lucky that COVID is not, it's a bad germ, but we're lucky it's not worse. There's no God-given reason that this germ couldn't be killing 10% of the people it afflicts. I mean, just imagine that for a moment. We could have had, or 30%. There's another coronavirus, so-called MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which started in 2012, probably went from bats to camels and from camels to people. The reason that hasn't exploded worldwide is that its R naught is probably 0.9. It's not very transmissible, but it's 30 times as deadly. It has the infection fatality rate for MERS is like 30%. Imagine this could have been the case. We could have had a very transmissible germ that was very deadly, just like in the movie Contagion, So it's not a joke. We do need to be prepared, and we need to learn our lessons. And I think the fact that so many scientifically advanced, wealthy countries, democracies even, were so unable to respond, even though they had scientists and experts who knew what to do, we didn't do it. And that's very alarming to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating that if you look, there was an article, a piece of research that was reported in The Economist, which came out in March or April, and it had a graph that showed that in general, over the last 50 years, democracies have responded better than non-democracies to pandemics. And the argument is, of course, you're more responsive to your people, so you take better steps. What's curious about this one is that that's not as clear a relationship. I mean, if we look at traditionally the strongest democracy, it's the United States. It hasn't perhaps played its best game over the last 8 or 9 months. And
are you kidding me? This is British understatement.
British understatement. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, no, we've been played an awful game. We've been terrible.
And then of course you've got China, which seems to have done quite a good job at dealing with it. So we seem to be at these moments of reversal. The other thing that I found curious was that I think the amount of money that went into coronavirus research prior to 2020 was something in the order of a few tens of millions of dollars across the global pharmaceutical industry. So it's a sort of vanishingly small proportion. And there seems to be essentially a fundamental market failure, right? It doesn't pay pharmaceutical companies to do research into these kind of respiratory diseases, so they don't, for lots of reasons to do with incentives. How do you imagine we will address that? Will we go off and say, listen, we need some global public goods around pandemic observatories, around research and development, around this kind of insurance for the next pandemic that will arrive within 10 or 12 years? Will we do that?
I don't know if we will. It's very difficult to sustain political will for things like that. It's like investing in CERN, to do basic particle physics research. If people don't understand that those investments yield returns over 100 years, William Faraday is doing experiments with electricity almost a century before we start getting amazing transformations in our society because of this exploration of electricity. Same thing happens with particle physics, and the same thing happens with public health and biology research. So, for example, HIV, I'm blocking on his name right now, the famous American scientist, the French. I'm blocking his name right now. The famous American scientist that was the co-discoverer of HIV, he was working on obscure retroviruses that only afflicted cats, right? And people thought, why the hell should we be studying these, esoteric viruses? This was before, humans started getting infected. Same with coronaviruses, right? Like people might have thought, well, coronaviruses cause the common cold in people and they cause problems for bats. Who the hell cares? That's not how basic science works. We need to. And now, especially with our attention heightened, investments in public health surveillance, as you said, public health awareness, in fundamental research on pathogens, also, frankly, in behavioral science research. We have an epidemic of misinformation right now. Mm-hmm. How do we understand that? Now, it is the case that always with epidemics, you can think of lies as being handmaidens to the germ, right? Like whenever germs spread, lies spread right behind them. This has happened with pandemics going back to the plague of Athens in 430 BC, all through the bubonic plague. This always happens. We need to understand the dynamics of misinformation. We need to do better social science research on behavior change. Anyway, there's a whole broad range of things that should be supported, in my view, so that we're not caught flat-footed again.
Yeah. But what does history tell us in previous pandemics and how we adjusted? Because we went through the post-pandemic order in 1918. Did we go off and tackle? I mean, we obviously went off and had some fun, right? Flappers and speakeasies and jazz and all those great things, right? But did we address some of the structural issues that related to resilience and health and so on? Yeah.
Yes, there were a lot of investments made in public health infrastructure, a lot of investments in public health research. Remember, we had this efflorescence of vaccines right after the 1918. We started short order having diphtheria toxin, tetanus, polio's a little later, measles, anti-tuberculosis campaigns, spittoons. People don't think about this, but prior to 1918, every restaurant had a spittoon. You would go and spit in the spittoon. Those people got rid of those right quick. So, there was a lot of changes in our society as a result of this. And so yes, I think there will be changes on the scientific front and socioeconomic changes that persist in our society.
Where do you think that dialogue will end up happening? Is it something that will happen at a national level? Is it something that you would prefer to see happen at an international level? Or do we need it to happen even more locally at the city level?
Every level.
Every level.
Yeah, I think it has to happen at every level. And we're also going to see a lot of that soon. For example, with vaccine distribution, we talked earlier about the cold chain. Every GP's practice is going to need maybe a specialized refrigerator in order to have the shot. Otherwise, everyone's going to have to go to their hospital. Now, that's fine to go to your hospital and get it. But people will suddenly be aware of the fact that, wait a minute, why can't I get this thing over here? And the reason is that we haven't made the investments in the infrastructure necessary to deliver it over there. And maybe we want to make those investments. So yes, on every level, local level, national level, international level. This is why, incidentally, I was a little bit upset, more than a little upset, that the United States recklessly, in my view, withdrew from the World Health Organization. You can criticize the WHO. There are pros and cons about what it has done in this epidemic or in general. But the idea that we don't need a WHO is wrong. And there's lots of good that WHO has done and can do and is doing. So yes, I think at every level we need effective coordination.
Now, Nicholas, I didn't want the last question to be leaving you upset, especially as you've been so generous with your time.
About what? Upset about what?
You were upset about the US leaving the World Health Organization. I want to just say something about your book, because we are up at time. The book I have had an opportunity to read. It's incredibly readable. You put it together during your lockdown, so you did have a productive few months, and it touches on so many more issues that we were not able to give justice to in this discussion. So I do recommend it. Apollo's Arrow. It's available on the major bookstores, I'm sure. Do you have any last thoughts, comments you would like to leave our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important to see that if there's lots of grounds for optimism, I need to be very clear. People are going to cooperate. We're going to share information. We're going to see the other side of this. I mean, plagues always end. They end. And this one will end too. And the only question is, how well do we do during our time of being challenged by a plague?
Very, very wise words. Nicholas Christakis, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, Azeem.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you soon.